Hi everyone, Dr. Green here, and this is the second of our two lectures on Native American captivity narratives that I had started with the previous lecture. So we've got a few more stories in our volume, which of course you guys should have in front of you so you can mark things and make notes as I talk. And we're going to sort of finish out and see some of the last thematic elements and some of the similarities and differences that these narratives have provided to us. Remember that I had told you guys in the first lecture that these were very popular stories. It was a popular genre, and some of the stories themselves, like the story of Mary Rowlandson, Elizabeth Olsen, and Hannah Duston, seem to have been very widely popular and were often published and republished. Remember that few of these narratives were written by the women about whom they tell, and some of them, like the Panther narrative, are completely invented. And that was a trait especially of the latter captivity narratives, that they tended to be complete works of fiction. Okay, so as we continue along, the one advantage I think that there is of me having the opportunity to speak to you guys this way, lecturing on video instead of lecturing live, is that remember that you can always pause me if you need to take notes or you need to get to a particular page number. It's really kind of cool, I think, that you're able to do that and then to refer back to the lectures as needed if you want to refresh your memory or take some more notes, etc. So don't forget that you can pause me as needed so that you can take notes. And all right, so let's go ahead then and start with Mary Jemison. And her account starts on page 122. She is taken captive on April the 5th of 1758. And what is interesting and what is different than every other story we've seen so far is that the French were a part of the native raiding party that took her. So now it's not just the natives. It's also the French that were with them as well. And Mary is given to the Seneca tribe to replace a family member. And I know we'll come to that here in a moment, but if I'm not mistaken, I think that it is a brother who has died, or a male member of one of the families has died, and Mary Jemison is given to them to replace him. So again, I had said in the first lecture that this is an interesting feature of one of the motivations for taking captives. Ransom was the primary one, but another reason is the sense of trying to transculturate or integrate people into their tribe as who initially are outsiders, but are given the opportunity to integrate. And as we see in the cases where the transculturation is both voluntary and permanent, that once they establish themselves in the tribe, they become full members of the tribe. And Mary Jemison was initially intended to replace this dead family member. As we see here on page 127, Mary Jemison is given a Native American name, and she chooses ultimately that this is where she wants to stay. She is transculturated and opts to maintain her status, but it's not like she doesn't understand that she comes from a different culture, but she has opted to stay. She has opted to keep this new identity. On page 127, it's interesting that, and also onto page 128, the first thing that our interviewer notes is her physical appearance. We first get this unmistakable description of her as a white woman with these light blue eyes, even though now she's obviously older. She's still described very much in that way. Her English still has a bit of her Irish accent in it because she is of Irish heritage. And then on to page 128, we see this very specific description of the Native American dress that she has adopted. And we're specifically told on page 128 that she wore it not as a matter of necessity, but from choice. And this issue of choice is not something that we've seen come up in very many of these stories. And I think that when we see that word choice, and we see women making these choices and opting for these and asserting their agency, it's very striking. And in this particular case, she has opted to adopt the ways of her adopted tribespeople. Now, on page 130, the story of Mary Jemison itself is told in the first person. Again, in that first sense of first person recollection. And she pretty much, by the end of it, will be integrated fully within the tribe. And on page 137, that is not necessarily an easy process. Remember that she doesn't know what's become of her parents, but she suspects that they've been killed. And there's that terrible scene where she finds out, yes, they were killed and scalped, and she can recognize the scalps as coming especially from her mother, who had the very distinctive hair. So it isn't as if these things happen peacefully. There is real horror that precedes someone like Mary Jemison still opting to voluntarily remain with the tribe. On page 142, this is where we learn that she is to replace the dead family member. She is to replace him and to be taken into the tribe. And on page 143, she gives us a little bit more detail about that. It is a custom of the Indians, when one of their number is slain or taken prisoner in battle, to give to the nearest relative to the dead or absent a prisoner if they have chanced to take one, and if not, to give him the scalp of an enemy. And in this case, Mary Jemison is able to take that role and to be given to the family as a replacement for the one who has died. Remember I talked about ethnography and whether or not we can really find any genuine and useful details about Native American life from reading these captivity narratives. I would argue that if those details are to be found and are to be valuable, it's probably Mary Jemison's text that is the most valuable in that regard. For example, on page 149, she gives this description of the daily life of the women. Cooking the hominy, how it is that they cooked, the utensils that they used, the different sorts of craft like sewing and weaving that she participated in. And given that she ultimately becomes a part of the culture, perhaps her account gives us the best insight into the rhythms of life that Native peoples might have lived. Again, perhaps more so than some of the others that seem to be much more surface in that respect. Okay, so on page 178, it is interesting because this is where we see that she has a choice. And again, another specific choice. She is given the opportunity, essentially, to leave. She's given the opportunity, as it says in the opening of the chapter, to go to her friends. And she thinks about it and says no. Accordingly, after I had duly considered the matter, I told my brother that it was my choice to stay and spend the remainder of my days with my Indian friends and live with my family as I had heretofore done. This seems to mark the point at which she is now sort of fully integrated from their side, from their perspective. He appeared well pleased with my resolution and informed me that as this was my choice, and again, they don't force her or compel her, I should have a piece of land that I should call my own, where I could live unmolested and have something at my decease to leave for the benefit of my children. So now she is fully integrated. She is now given land. And the rest of the story, I think, is very wide-ranging. She talks about a lot of historical moments, a lot of the histories and the experiences of the tribe itself more generally, and then, of course, her specifically as a part of that. So I think even more so than some of the other stories, her story feels to me much more closely related to a historical account with the value that such an account can give us, but also, again, of course, with some of the limitations given the specific lens that we have here. All right, this ends essentially as many of the other stories do with the sense of reflection. She reflects back on her life. She reflects on the life that she's lived, the children that she's had, and the fact that she has her own house and her own land. And that, of course, is somewhat remarkable for the time. But again, it is a testament to the choice that she made to remain a member of the tribe. All right, so let's move on to Mary Godfrey, and her narrative is very interesting, and this starts on page 217, because the background itself again, kind of gives us insight into why these events played out the way that they did. The Seminole tribe in Florida was very resistant to being pushed off of their land, and this was causing increasing tensions with the settlers who wanted that land. So this is a story that deals with a very complex set of historical circumstances. The treaties, the breaking of treaties, the increasing tensions and violence with the Seminoles. And this is another one of these stories where we really don't know if Mary Godfrey actually existed or not. The story is probably more important for the history that it tries to incorporate, rather than whether or not Mary Godfrey as a literal human being actually existed. I mean, obviously, as we read, we can see that many of the hallmarks of any of the other stories that we've read are here. So it could very well be a generic captivity narrative. They name the woman Mary Godfrey, but it's used as an opportunity to comment on some of these other historical events. And I think that what is very telling on page 217 has to do with a comment about the Seminoles in Florida. Since the commencement of offensive operations by the savages, which may be viewed as a war of extermination, as they appear disposed neither to give or take quarter, pains have been taken to collect every fact of an important and interesting nature relative to the cause and progress of the alarming and bloody conflict with which to present the public. Again, it's one-sided. It is definitely a one-sided account, but I think that use of the word extermination is very telling and very, very sad. Obviously, we know that many tribes were pretty much hunted or brought nearly to that point of extinction. And there's really kind of this sense now of the end game of the westward expansion, the end game of the pressures that settlers had for more and more land. And obviously here by 1833, we're now dealing with America as a burgeoning country. The Seminoles really appear in the way that they're described to have this kind of grim sense of determination. If they're not going to give up the land, they're going to have to be killed. And I don't think that your author here has too much of a problem with this idea that they're going to be quote unquote exterminated because they're unlikely, that they're not going to stop the fight. And clearly it also speaks to that attitude that it's going to be the Americans who are going to win, that the natives are sort of destined to lose. Remember early on in the Puritan lectures, we talked about manifest destiny and this idea that God's providence called for them to move all across the country from coast to coast. This is feeding into that idea here that it is inevitable that they will win. So again, we can see the attitudes that are bleeding through here. On one of the other more extraordinary things about this text that we really see in earnest on pages 222 and on to 223 is that Mary Godfrey and her children are saved by a black man. They're saved by this man who doesn't have any interest in trying to help her. It's dangerous to himself. This is still a time of slavery. And quite frankly, in some cases, it didn't much matter if someone was actually a slave. They would just be taken as one. And you can see an example of that in the great film 12 Years a Slave, which is the true account of a freeman who was taken as a slave, and nobody really cared that he wasn't a slave. So this is something that I wonder about. How would audiences at the time who are reading the story of Mary Godfrey at a time where slavery still has another 3 decades before it is abolished, how would they have reacted to this insertion of this African-American man who saves this woman and her children when it is absolutely detrimental in many ways to him to risk himself to do so? The natives are placed in that negative light. But because of the way that he is depicted, there are many scholars who think that there is something of the abolitionist flavor to this particular story. Because again, if it is fully an invention, then it really doesn't matter who it is that might help Mary Godfrey along the way. It's specific here that this is a black man, and I think that that's what makes it a very interesting addition to the captivity narratives that are in our book. All right, so one of the last then of our stories is the story of Sarah Wakefield, which is also one of the longer tales. She is taken in 1862, which is historically remarkable because we are dealing with the Civil War. On top of everything else and the other tensions that you see, this is the time of the Civil War, and we are leading up to the point at which Lincoln is going to abolish slavery in America. So this one is historically significant in terms of its placement. The westward expansion is still in full swing, and in many ways, she sort of tells that story of moving west and sort of moving away from more familiar surroundings. Sarah Wakefield is also interesting because she was often called, quote unquote, an Indian lover and was accused of colluding with them. And there's a lot of critics that really kind of take issue with this because in some places, she seems to be more sympathetic to them as a whole, and she seems to sort of call out the whites for their own behavior and atrocities towards Native peoples. But then again, critics will say, and I can see where this comes from, and quite frankly, I think I kind of read it this way too, is she really encouraging an understanding of Native peoples, as if there could be a peaceful resolution or some sort of peaceful coexistence? Or is she writing about a time of self-preservation, kind of the way that we've seen some of these other women who have figured out what they need to do strictly to survive? It seems perhaps that a modern sensibility might want to look back to this era and try to find somebody, some author, some person who was sympathetic to the Native Americans and what was happening with them. And while there were authors who certainly were, I'm not completely convinced that Sarah Wakefield is necessarily one of them. And again, you guys are always free to disagree with me and to dialogue about this very issue, but it is important about to this text and to debates about it. But on page 244, towards the bottom of the page, she doesn't generally speak of the natives too terribly highly. In this case, she says, many persons say the Indian cannot be civilized. I think they can, but did not know it until I lived among them. That is a backhanded compliment if I've ever heard one. So she's like, yeah, they're not totally savage, and they can be civilized, but she isn't advocating their own value as they are. She's advocating their value in terms of their ability to be, quote unquote, civilized. So again, I tend to think that this isn't so much a call for understanding, because her language doesn't really continue to support that. On page 249, we again see hints of some of the history at this time. And she talks about Indian payment, she says. In June, these people usually come in for the lands which they have sold to the United States, some coming many hundreds of miles. And if the money is not ready, they expect to find food for themselves, procured at the expense of the government, as that is part of their treaty. So now we have the ceding of lands to the United States government. Sometimes the government doesn't seem to have been too terribly quick or fair about paying for the lands that had been sold or given to the government. But again, as we continue along and as we continue to read, it really does seem like she doesn't have a completely positive attitude towards her captors. For example, towards the bottom of page 256, she talks about how she helps with the blankets. She helps to paint the blankets. She helps to braid the manes of the horses. But she says she does this to make herself useful, hoping by such conduct to gain their friendship. Not because she wants to be friends. That would be a misreading. She's clear that if she can make herself useful, think again of Mary Rowlandson thinking the same way, it is less likely that they would all of a sudden turn on her and kill her. It's more likely that not only would she be kept alive, but hopefully she would ultimately be ransomed for money and then be given her freedom back again. So as we conclude her story and we look at page 308, we get this kind of interesting letter, and this seems to perhaps be the only real place where she shows a more genuine and specific sense of compassion when she finds out that Chaska has been mistakenly executed. And basically, Riggs, who writes the letter, says, well, sorry about that. It's just a mistake. Could have happened to anyone. This seems to have been the only place where she's really sympathetic. But again, she's sympathetic in a specific context, specifically with regards to what happens to Chaska. But I'm not sure that we are in on steady ground if we try to extrapolate that out to reflect some sort of a larger sentiment that she had towards not only even just the tribe, the Seminoles, but more generally. All right, so the last of our stories is the story of Emmeline Fuller, which many critics will note is kind of a story of the American experience at this time. The movement west, people even voluntarily so moving west to the frontier. Eventually, Emmeline Fuller gets all the way across the frontier where she speaks about being in Eastern Oregon. So hers, in some ways, is a story of the American movement west and the American movement across these lands. Again, lands that often had been in the lived on by Native Americans who were then displaced. But this account is different because they are traveling in a much larger group. But in terms of that frontier attitude that I think permeates the story, the sense of rugged individualism, the sense of being able to persevere and sort of do for yourself. Page 328, towards the bottom of the page, she talks about Mr. Myers, who is one of the members that is in their party. And she doesn't really speak high of them. The frontier claims people's lives if they're not tough. And here is Mr. Myers, who is basically bogging the entire rest of the group down. She says that if it hadn't been for him, and if it hadn't been for the fact that he is begging and begging and begging, which isn't making him look in such a good light as a man at this time, she says they would have made it to the fort much more quickly. And remember, the fort is a place of safety. If they can get to the fort, then they will have some protection from the American troops that are there. So this, again, is an interesting account because it shapes her story of captivity and fleeing under this larger sense of the experience of the American frontier and the movement west. And with Emmeline Fuller, we reach the end of the captivity narratives and the end of our discussion for this lecture. Again, I want you to pay attention as you conclude your thoughts this week about the variety of the stories. And I'd also like you to think about the fact that they were so popular and really identify what it was about these stories that was so resonant across so much of a period of American history, from the early Puritan colonies through the Revolution and independence from England, up through the Civil War. What is it about these stories that would make them so consistently popular to the point where people just made them up as fiction and sold them off as captivity narratives? All right, that leaves you guys a lot to think about, and I will see you in the next lecture.